Okay, well, I guess we can get going. So who's expecting to do a presentation today? You're Ryan? Okay, anybody else? Just Ryan today? Okay. Ryan, did you submit, upload? Perfect. Okay, so we'll do it just like we have been doing right after the break. We'll do Ryan's presentation and then we'll do the quiz. I'm glad we only have one presentation today because we have a lot of material to cover. So let's see if we can get the projector on. All right. And we do have students joining us by Zoom, and I'm recording. All right, what is going on here? All right. I was having like flashbacks. I was going to have to teach without a projector. The old days. Okay. So before we get into the chapter, I'll take practice problems 7 and 8. If you have them today, hopefully everyone who have turned in 7 today. Today's kind of the last day. Although, I'm being really flexible. So if there's some reason we haven't done it yet, let me know. 8 technically is due this week, but again, flexible. So next Tuesday is fine. So I think looking at the schedule here, I think I have it set up so that like this week was chapter 8, practice problems due this week, next week's chapter 9. But I think it would be fine running a week behind. So chapter 8 on next Tuesday, chapter 9 on Tuesday after. Please be sure to check the solutions. In fact, let's turn on right now. So on the practice problem solutions here, chapters 1 and 3 are now there. Chapter 7's there. Right, these are the problems that were assigned. So that I know some of you have different versions of the book, different editions, so you don't have the exact problems. These are the problems that are assigned. These are what the midterm is going to be based on. So this is your study guide. So when you study for the midterm, go look at these practice problem solutions and make sure that you have understanding. Okay. Oh, yeah, just put it all in one file, it's fine. Okay, great. All right. So when I looked at the recording for Tuesday, I learned that when I put it on presentation mode, it didn't record that. It just recorded this first slide. So I'm not going to put it in presentation mode today. Okay, so on Tuesday, we talked about inflation. No, we didn't talk about inflation. We talked about unemployment. So let's quickly review unemployment. So unemployment is anytime you have people that want to work and they can't find a job or they're not working, they're unemployed. That people that want to work is your labor force. And one of the ratios we look at is the labor force participation rate. So labor force participation rate is the people that want to work divided by the people that theoretically could work. So human beings in the country 16 or older. Then your unemployment rate is the number of those unemployed workers that want to work who can't find a job divided by the labor force. Okay. There are problems with using the unemployment rate solely. So some of those problems are it can overstate the true level of employment and it can understate it. How does it understate it? Well, because there are classes of workers that it doesn't count, such as discouraged workers, people that can't find a job and they give up. So if they give it up, they're no longer looking for work, so they're out of the labor force. People that are marginally attached, well, I could work, I could not work, so they're not actively looking. Underemployed, you need to work full time and you can only find a part-time job. That's underemployed. When you add in these areas that aren't counted under the official unemployment rate, you see unemployment could be much higher. So in 2010, the greatest unemployment since the Great Depression, we had an unemployment rate nearly 20%. And remember, that's 20% of the labor force, which is only half of or so of the total population. So if you look in the Great Recession, let's say the labor force was about half the population. So we're down to 175 million people. And then almost 20% of those people were unemployed. So what is that? 30 million people. So of 350 million people in the country in 2010, only 140 million were employed. Okay, unemployment rate also doesn't show how that number is affecting subgroups. Unemployment is heavily correlated to the recession and boom cycle of the economy. However, not always. So it is possible. A recession almost always leads to higher unemployment, but a boom cycle doesn't always lead to more jobs. It's called a jobless recovery. Okay. And again, subgroups are not always treated differently by the unemployment rate. So in this particular case, fresh students, women tend to have a easier time finding jobs coming out of a recession than men do. Okay. And then we talked about the different types of unemployment. There's frictional. So this is just the fact that there's an imbalance in information. So I don't know which employer is hiring with my skill set, so it takes me a couple months to find that. And as an employer, I don't know who's all in the work for what I want to pay, so it takes me a couple months to find that. That's frictional. That's when the systems are working fine, but they don't 100% match up. So those gaps where they don't 100% match up is that frictional unemployment. Okay. And then we look at structural unemployment. So this is where the systems in place don't quite work. This is where employers need people with skills and the potential workers don't have those skills. So in coal mining areas of the country, coal mines shut down and those coal miners don't have the tech skills to go be computer programmers. That's a structural problem. So one way to tell if it's structural is that even at the peak of the business cycle, even when it's at the boom times, employers can't find the people they would need to hire, and people in the workforce can't find the jobs they're qualified for. Okay, and we talked about some of the causes of structural labor unions causing artificial structural problem. Efficiency wages cause a problem. Minimum wage is a type of efficiency wage type of problem. So how does that mean? What do we mean by that? Well, the minimum wage is that the government says no employer can pay less than a certain amount per hour. But there might be people in the workforce that are willing to work for less than that. So if minimum wage is $11 an hour here in Oregon, there might be people in this workforce willing to work for $7 an hour, but they can't. So that forced to pay higher than what the natural equilibrium price is a forced efficiency wage, forced by government policy. And this looks on a graph. At the equilibrium price is here, and here is when a efficiency wage or a minimum wage raises that above. Again, the question is, well, how does that even, how does efficiency wage, what is the problem there? Well, you remember the supply is the supply of labor. So this is people looking for jobs, it's workers. They're supplying labor, and this is demand. So as the salary goes up, there's a lot less demand. Employers don't want to hire so many people at 15 bucks an hour, but they're willing to hire a lot more at 10 bucks an hour. So always when you look at your graphs, think about who is supplying, who's demanding. We often think the supplier is the company, the seller, but in this particular case, the company is buying labor. They're in the demand side. Okay, so the last part about unemployment is this cyclical unemployment. So to understand cyclical, first we need to understand what natural unemployment is. So natural unemployment is the frictional, the fact that it just takes time to get a new job, plus the structural, the fact that sometimes there's a mismatch between what people can do and want to do and what employers need to be done. If you add those together, those are natural unemployment. But that's not actual unemployment. The actual unemployment rate is natural plus cyclical. So what is cyclical? What's the cycle we're talking about? Well, it's not the seasons. Right? I mean, seasonal might affect unemployment, winter jobs, summer jobs, whatever, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the business cycle. So when the recession hits and people start laying off jobs and unemployment rate goes high, that's a cyclical thing. So that's taken structural, which would exist if there was no business cycle. If the business cycle stayed flat, and never went up and down, if we never have recessions, never go up, we would still have frictional and structural unemployment. Cyclical refers to when there's a boom time, people are hiring, so there's less unemployment than normal. And when there's a recession, people stop hiring and lay people off. So that cycle of the down cycle leads to additional unemployment. So lower growth is usually correlated with higher unemployment. So when GDP falls, firms lay off workers. Idle capital, labor, economic growth, not to maximize that. It goes to the ability of the economy to make more jobs. So let that sink in for a second. Right? Cyclical refers to the cycle of the business cycle, booms and busts. Okay. So what causes changes in the natural rate of unemployment? Changes in the labor force, changes in demographics. The changes in demographics is kind of interesting. So in the 70s and 80s, Canada loosened its immigration policy to only want, they made it really easy for educated people with advanced degrees to immigrate to Canada. And they made it really hard for people without advanced degrees to immigrate to Canada. So that changed the demographics quite a bit and made the demand for lower wage jobs change because there was less people can do them, and the demand for higher wage jobs also dramatically changed because there was an abundance of highly educated people. So that changes the unemployment. All right, unions, temp agencies, and new technology are part of our institutions that might change the employment and unemployment, and changes in government policies. Okay, so this is another change in demographics. From 1940 to 2017, we see a larger percentage of women entering the workforce. Taking jobs that otherwise would have been taken, but also increasing that additional labor increases the cycle of the economy, creating more jobs. And then we see baby boomers, right? The baby boom happened in 1945 to 1955. So then there was a sudden influx of younger people in the job market as they hit working age, and we see this bump in labor force participation. Okay, so that's unemployment. Okay, let's talk inflation. Inflation hurts the economy, but as the authors of this book think, people don't understand how. So let's talk about that concept first. But before we do that, let's talk about the consumer price index that's continually increased, but the inflation rate fluctuates. What is this graph telling us? Well, the green is price level on a steady linear climb. And the purple is the inflation rate. Up and down, up and down, up and down. Really high until 1980, and then really low until 2017. So how do those correspond? Well, I hope the engineers in the class probably get this concept pretty well, but this is the rate of change. And the rate of change corresponds to the actual change. This is the actual change, price is going up at this steady rate, and this is the rate that is changing every year. Well, look what happened here in 1980 when we had an inflation rate really high. You can see the slope of the actual price change is steeper. And then down here, when we changed our government policies to try to keep inflation around 2%, which happened in this period, the slope evens out and stays steady. And we had this disastrous period of deflation here, where the inflation went negative, and then we see a dip in price levels. Right? Remember, we don't want a dip in price levels. That's bad. People start hoarding money. The other thing you notice here is that you can see for many years now, at least the last decade, and this would continue on until the pandemic, inflation rate has been below 2%. That's below our target. As a country, we try to target 2%. Inflation rate has been unusually low. So then when we heard last year the inflation rate went to 7%, well, look at it. Historically, 7%, it's not that bad. Not only that, we like to be at 2%. And we've been below 2% for so many years that we're just back on track with our overall price level trend. Okay, but let's talk about that first point, how it hurts the economy, but not in the way you might think. So inflation doesn't make you poor. If you really want to measure what makes you poor, you have to look at real wages. Real wage is the rate of your wage rate divided by the price level. Real income is income divided by the price level. And this is should be fairly intuitive. prices go up 2% this year, but I make 2% more, then I'm in the same shape I was. So inflation only hurts the economy when it's out of line with overall growth, out of line with wages. Okay. So we like to distinguish between level of prices and inflation rate. You know, this graph, level of prices and the rate of these prices changing. That's the difference. Okay, so we do that, we make the inflation rate. Inflation rate is a price level in year one minus the price level in year two over the price level in year one. That gives the inflation rate. All right. So they give us an example. If CPI increases from 120 to 135 over 1 year, what's the inflation rate? Well, year two, 135 minus year one over year one times 100 and make it a percentage, 12.5%. Can anybody answer the question or have an idea why price level matters, but not inflation, or why inflation, what's the right wording here? What makes inflation bad? Why can inflation be bad? But we have to look at price level to know. Yeah, I think I might have worded that weirdly. So if you don't understand the question, let me explain. The problem is not that inflation is causing prices to go up. The problem is when that rate of change, otherwise known as inflation rate, is too high, too much of a dramatic change. So look at this change in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And the rate of change of price levels went from 2% up to 12%, and then back down to 4%, up to 14%. And this is over the course of a couple years. So you go to the store one day and milk is $1, and you go to the store the next day, it's $1.50. And then you go back and the next day is $1 again, and you go back and, you know, this is more like over months, and it's $2 now. So why is that bad? Well, because your paycheck didn't change. The invisible hand of the market takes time. So when the rate of change is too high, the other parts of the economy, like your paycheck, take time to reflect that. So inflation is bad when the rate of change is too high for the rest of the price level and the rest of the economy to catch up. Okay. So let's get into a little bit more about the costs of inflation. Well, what are the other costs of inflation? How does it drag on the economy? Well, there's shoe leather costs. Increased cost of transaction caused by inflation. All right, so this is called shoe leather because of the actual wear to your shoes as you're running around the city, trying to deal with the increased cost of transaction. So when we see in hyper inflation economies, the book uses Germany in the 1920s, money is losing value so quick that if somebody gave you money for something, you would literally run to the bank and exchange it for gold or something that doesn't lose its value before it loses value. Because if you waited until the next day, that money that you got today will be worth way less. So literally, you wore down your shoe leather, running around, making multiple trips to the bank every day to exchange that money into something that holds its value. So that's a cost. But the other cost there is, so the banks during hyperinflation see way increased customer usage. Customers coming in, so they have to hire more. And yeah, so you hire more, that's a good thing because you're adding a job to the economy, but it's not very efficient because you're hiring more tellers, doing busy work essentially. So that's a drag on using our resources efficiently. Right. So this is this other economics in action. I don't know if anybody signed up for that, but there's an example from Israel. So people are literally spending line in banks, trying to get rid of their currency that's losing value so quick. And because of that, they're not out with their jobs. They're not adding to the economy in other ways. Okay, the second cost of inflation is the menu cost. So if I run a restaurant and I print out a bunch of menus with my food choices and the price, I expect that printout to last me a couple of years. But if money's losing value so quick, I have to keep increasing my prices. I got to print out new menus every 6 months. That's a huge cost. Right? That's a menu cost. This probably seems less of a cost now because of like you go to McDonald's or something, it's electronic changes, or printing actual menus actually costs a lot less now than it did even 20 or 30 years ago. But what about you go to the grocery store and it has the tags for each price? As inflation rises, they have to hire clerks to go around and change the little price of the grocery store. That costs a lot of money to hire the staff to do that. Okay, so then there's a unit of account costs. So what is money? And we're actually going to spend a whole chapter talking about this, but what is money? Like, I mean, in a philosophical way, what's money? I mean, it's pretty abstract. Yeah.
Money is basically something of value that you can use to trade for something.
Yeah. Yeah. So money doesn't have, money's a substitute. It's a placeholder for value. Yeah. So it doesn't really have any value. Did you have a, yeah.
Something like a representation of what work. Like hours.
Yeah. Yeah. So if why would I take this abstract thing to represent my time and labor? I take it because I have a belief in its value. And as inflation's happening, if it's happening out of sync with the rise in price level and out of sync with the rest of the economy, you have hyperinflation or a high inflation rate, I lose faith in the value of that dollar, right? I lose faith as a unit of account. It makes it less reliable. I no longer know. If I see a $10 bill, I know that can buy me lunch now. Right? I know that can get me a quarter tank of gas or whatever. I have an idea of what the unit of account is. If prices are rising so quick, I don't no longer know what $10 is worth. So when inflation is high, it's really hard to make those calculations of what the value of these things. Right? You know, this is a $100 trillion Zimbabwe bill. If you went to Zimbabwe at the height of their hyperinflation, you would just see these $1 trillion bills lying on the ground because they're worthless. $1 trillion, right? Because people can't keep up and do the mental math. Okay, so inflation isn't bad. Inflation is actually good in most circumstances. It's bad when the rate of inflation happens quicker than the economy can absorb that inflation. But there's some other implications from inflation, and then there's winners and losers. And winners and losers are the people depending on the amount of inflation when you're borrowing money, or if you're the bank, or if you're the borrower, you're impacted by inflation. So if I borrow money and I'm going to borrow like $10,000 and I'm going to have an interest rate of say 10%, I have to pay that $10,000 back plus some form of that 10%, calculated every month or every year. And that's all great and good, but if I'm paying over 5 years, then the value of money is going to be less. So how do you figure that in? Well, most loans don't figure that in. They don't know what the inflation rate is going to be in the next 5 years. So if I'm paying 10% interest a year on my outstanding loan, but inflation is 5%, at the end of year one, that money that I'm paying back is 5% less valuable. So who does that help? Well, it helps me if I'm the borrower because I'm paying back less money. And it hurts the bank because they're receiving money that's less valuable. So to account for that in calculations, you have to look at what the net nominal interest rate is and the real interest rate. So nominal is the number on your bank loan, the number on the actual paperwork. We're charging you 8.99% interest per year. The real interest rate, though, is that 8.99 minus whatever inflation is. So this particular year, when inflation was 7%, if I took out a loan a year ago, and the bank and I were both expecting inflation to be what normally is about 2%, but we had hyperinflation almost 7%. I'm actually only going to pay on that loan 8.99 minus the 7%. And since no one was expecting that to be so high, the bank didn't calculate it in. So now 8.99% is actually pretty high right now. So I took out a car loan, a big car loan, beginning of the pandemic. And I think I'm paying like 3%, something like that. So when inflation was 2%, the bank the bank was only expecting to make 1% real interest, 1% profit. But when inflation went to 7%, now that money I'm paying back is worth less. So in fact, I'm paying less money. The bank is receiving less money. What's 3% minus 7%? So the bank not only didn't make a profit off my loan last year, they lost 4% value. I made out on that deal. I wish I took out more money here before the recession. Right. So I'm not the only winner with my Tesla car loan. If you were buying a house in the 80s, be right before stagflation, you made out then too. Because you remember I showed the graph. Imagine you took out a loan here. And then the next year, inflation went up 10 points. All that money you're making payments, those fixed payments you're making to the bank is now worth less. It would have been a good time. Of course, what that information leaves out is that if you have parents or whatever that bought a house at this time, mortgage interest rates were 24%. Now you get a mortgage for 2%. Okay, so this is a weird one. So I'll explain this, but if inflation really isn't that bad, why do we care? Well, we care because it's bad when it gets out of alignment with the rest of the economy. It hurts people in the short term. But it's also bad because once it gets too high, it's really hard to get it back down. It hurts. That process is called disinflation. Bringing the inflation rate back down. And here's why it hurts. We already know inflation is correlated heavily with unemployment, and we know it's correlated heavily with growth in the business cycle. So one affects the other. So we're promoting growth, we're promoting unemployment, or employment, not unemployment. And the side effect of that is that inflation goes high. So one causes the other. But what happens when you reverse that? What happens if inflation is high and now we want to lower inflation? What do? We have to do the opposite we're doing before. So if encouraging employment, do you have a question?
Why would it be like said separate from deflation?
Yeah, deflation is good question. So disinflation is the process of lowering the rate of inflation. Deflation is negative inflation. So disinflation is making it go from 10% inflation down to 5%. Deflation is when it goes to like negative. It's a difference in the change of rate versus the final value. Okay, anyway, so you're changing the cause and effect. All right, so here's how this works. So you have two lines, two different scenarios here. Both start up here. And in 1974, on the blue line, right, you have an unemployment rate down here, just over 5%, and you have an inflation rate of 10%. Oh, well, that's high. Oh my God, the inflation rate's 10%. That's higher than we want. So how do you lower that? Well, unfortunately, you have to slow down the economy. So then we see they're making policies to slow down the economy. And for a while, inflation just keeps going up and up and up. But at the same time, employment's going up. So now everyone's being hurt. People losing their jobs, recession hits, inflation's still happening. And then you get to an inflection point, and then inflation starts coming way down. But unemployment doesn't. And then eventually you get to a point where you've slowed the economy enough where you get both under control. Same thing happened a few years later. January inflation rate is above 12%. Unemployment is 6%, 6.5%. Same thing. They hit the brakes in the economy. It takes a while, but then unemployment starts. Well, actually, unemployment goes way down, but then it finally gets a hold on. So that's why we like to keep inflation at a constant level, because it hurts us. It really hurts us if it gets too high. We have to like then put the brakes on things and lower it. All right. Any questions on inflation? Okay. Well, let's take a break. 5 minutes. Come back at 40 after. All right, so we'll do Ryan. So you ready? Come on up.
So I think my version of the textbook is a little older, so I don't know if these ones corresponded exactly, but these are my chapter 8. Awesome. So this first one was just kind of a quick introduction. The bad old days. So there was a British channel, it was called 4TV, and they decided to film a documentary. This was in the year 1999, about a family that they made live in like a fake 1900s style house. So that means everything was exactly the same as it was in the 1900s, or in the year 1900. So they had no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no washing machines, pretty much all of the modern day conveniences they were made to live without. I'm not sure how long it went on, but it was quite a while, at least several months. And their goal was kind of to illustrate how large the improvement in standards of living had been in developed countries, at least for the past 100 years or so. But even today, many countries are still worse off than even that 1900 family was. And this is because most developed countries have experienced what's called long-run economic growth, which is kind of the focus of Chapter 8, more or less. And you see that in countries like the US, Canada, Japan, Britain, and pretty much all of the classic developed countries. They have exponentially more economic output now than they did back then. And that can be seen in contrast in underdeveloped countries that have not had that same long-run economic growth. I did not do those animations. So that was the introduction, and now this was the economics in action. It was called The Luck of the Irish, and it's another kind of long-run growth example. So in the 19th century, Ireland was one of the poorest countries in Europe, even worse off than places like Argentina and Venezuela. And millions of people were leaving Ireland to escape the famine and poverty, making the problem worse. You've probably heard of the Irish potato famine. That was one of the main causes of this major recession that was going on in Ireland. And that just caused everyone to leave trying to escape the poverty. Today, on the other hand, Ireland has become one of Europe's richest countries, though, with the GDP that is growing almost as fast as that as China, as seen on the graphic there, just 2% behind or so. This is due largely to their excellent infrastructure. So they've focused on things like airports, telecommunications, shipping facilities, and lots of other things, and their education system, which they've invested heavily in. And both of those things, all of those developments have attracted lots of international investors. So lots of money has been poured into the Irish economy, and that's led to this growth rate that is so high. And so the questions at the end of this economics in action, the first one, why do economists use real GDP per capita as the best measure for economic progress rather than something like nominal GDP per capita or real GDP? So this is probably pretty obvious to most of you since we've been learning about this for the past couple of classes. But the real GDP per capita is the best measurement of economic progress because it takes into account things like the population size of the country and price changes over years, which is the inflation rate, making it more holistic and accurate than things like nominal GDP per capita and real GDP, which don't give you the full picture. And then the second question in this economics in action was use the rule of 70 to calculate how long it will take each of the countries to double their GDP per capita. So China, with their growth rate of 7.6, it'll only take them 9.2 years. And I think this data on the graph is all from the year almost 2000, or like late 1990s, somewhere around there. Ireland, not far behind at 13.5 years. The US way behind that at 35 years. France at 39.9 years, and Argentina at 700 years. So probably not in the near future. And that is all.
Great. Yeah, I always want to see this show. I've never seen it, but it's a great idea. We tend to lose sight of the fact of how much progress we've made as a society. Being rich 100 years ago was a worse quality of life in so many ways than being poor today in a developed country, that is. And that's the underlying concept behind economic growth is good. Ireland has actually turned itself into a tech mega location, in large part to building on infrastructure. So most every tech company has office and workforce in Ireland. So with building out the infrastructure, they invite tech companies to come, and then those tech companies will hire programmers, which then increases the quality of life and the educational opportunities for people in Ireland. A little bit more complicated. In fact, we talked about, I don't know if we're going to get to that chapter, but Ireland currently, one of the reasons why tech companies go there is that a very low corporate tax rate. So it's very attractive to companies to go there, and if you have an office in a country, you're able to do some kind of funny math and put profits there. They have to stay there. You can't bring them back to the US without paying US corporate tax, but a lot of companies would rather open an office in Ireland and have money sitting in Ireland bank accounts than pay US taxes. Okay, well, let's do the quiz and then leave. Okay, so here's today's password.